I'm going to go through modern money theory again, trying not to repeat too many slides from the first day. There are a few in here for review. I'll try to cover new topics and some more details. And there were 3 readings. The Response to Critics by Eric Tomoyne and me is extremely detailed. I will present a bit simpler versions of what's in there, but you'll recognize it. I'll have a simple diagram, and I'll go through some of the steps that apply to the US that also are common in other countries. But first I wanted to just start with this. I don't know if you know the New Yorker. It's sort of an elite magazine for well-educated, especially East Coast people. You look here at number 49, I don't know if you read it, it's Keynesians are to blank as modern monetary theorists are to owls. So some of you, if you follow Stephanie Kelton, you know she came up with this classification. Modern money theory are owls, which are the smart birds. The typically mainstream economists are the hawks, and Keynesians are the doves. Okay. What other heterodox theory has ever made it into mainstream media, into crossword puzzles? Marx, yes, okay, in the past. Post-Keynesians, at least in the United States, I don't know, Brazil could be different. Never happened. Modern money theory has had full page in the Washington Post. It's discussed frequently in the New York Times and many other of the mainstream media. We were always told by post-Keynesians especially, it's just too radical. Nobody will ever listen to this. Okay? The government can't run out of money, that's crazy. Okay? It's discussed all the time now in the mainstream media. And when I talk about the job guarantee, which I think is the next topic, it's been picked up by all the main Democratic candidates. So anyway, this has created a problem. So I've used this slide for a long time. When we say the federal government spends through keystrokes that credit bank accounts so it can afford anything for sale in dollars, and this applies to any country that has its own currency. The reaction goes through 4 stages. Okay, first it's crazy, and then fear, and the main fear is hyperinflation, and then moral indignation, because I don't have time to talk about it, but I have talked about it in some of the things I've written. You know, economics from the beginning was a moral science, and mainstream has tried to pretend as if it's a positive science, that is, it's all fact-based. But it's actually morality, and the fear of budget deficits is moral. There's just no doubt about this. People feel there's something wrong with a government that runs deficits. It's moral, really, more than any kind of reason. And then you're a pinko commie fascist. These are our friends. These are the post-Keynesians who call us these things. And I'm not making this up. They really do call us those things. A lot of times at the same time, of course, it's complete nonsense. How can you be both a commie and a fascist? Very bizarre.
Pinko what?
Pinko commie. In America, you're pinko. If you're too far to the left. Okay, I didn't get to talk about Ingham's work. Ingham has been very important at Cambridge. He's not an economist, he's a sociologist, but he emphasizes the social nature of money, and I realized when I was putting this together, I didn't mention this the other day. So money is an institution, I did say that. That's the institutionalist approach to money. It's not a thing. Money cannot be a thing. Ingham is the best on this. Money is a social relation. Okay, and what orthodoxy tries to do is to turn money into a thing, and that's intentional. They want to ignore the social relationship. Social relationship, of course, the main thing is there's a creditor and a debtor. And generally speaking, it's better to be a creditor. And so they want to ignore that aspect of the creditor-debtor relationship. He says money is social in three ways. It's produced outside the market. No individual is free to produce their own money. Graziani says that too, remember. It must be legitimately sanctioned. So there always have been authorities from the very beginning. It's counted by those who count. Okay, they are the ones who came up with the money measure of account. It comes from the authorities. Monetary exchange consists in a social relation. Okay, not the Robinson Crusoe Friday barter relation, which is not social. It's a one-off trade and then you're done. But that's not the way that exchange takes place in a capitalist economy. There's a continuing social relationship because what you get paid in is somebody's debt. At the very least, you have this creditor-debtor relationship. Today, money stuff, money things, money records, whatever you want to call it, consists in symbols of the states or the bank's promise to pay. Okay? So I think I did present this slide on the first day, so just to review. The use of currency and value of money are based on the power of the issuing authority, not on any intrinsic value, and that's true even when we're talking about gold coins. The value of a gold coin is not determined by the gold content. This is a misconception that has been perpetrated, foisted on people by orthodoxy. The value of coins was never determined by gold content. The state played a central role in the evolution of money. One nation, one currency rule. I'll come back to that because I'm going to talk about good, hard, and the special case of the euro. Taxes drive money. The state chooses a money account, imposes obligations denominated in that same money account, issues the currency that can be used to pay taxes. Okay, we did talk, was it yesterday? Could have been yesterday, a bit about unsustainable debt path. The economists claim that we're on an unsustainable debt path. 70% of Americans say progress on the deficit is needed. This number goes up and down. It depends on how much this is in the media. It's pretty clear they're just responding to what they've heard. Chinese might stop lending to us. Hyperinflation, burden our grandkids. I'll come back to these things. And then look at Euroland. So all of these arguments I'll come back to why they're really not problems. Thomas Smith, not Adam Smith, completely different Smith, in 1832 also wrote about paper money. The paper money has no intrinsic value. It is only an imputed one, and therefore when issued it is with a redeeming clause. Remember I talked about the colonies, I just wanted to show you. Here's another example where someone will recognize that it should be taken back or otherwise withdrawn in a future period. The value is maintained by redemption. Okay, so as long as you redeem that currency, you stand by ready to redeem it in payment of obligations, it will maintain value. This continuing with Smith, he also understood that the government spends first, then collects taxes. I won't read the whole long quote, but the idea is the Bank of England, so now we're not talking about the American colonies, we're talking about England. The Bank of England issues the notes that will be used to pay taxes in redemption. Okay? Another long quote from Smith, I won't read it. Banks issue the notes that debtors will use to make payments to the banks in redemption. So he's arguing there's an equivalency. Okay? The government notes, which are Bank of England notes by this time, are redeemed in tax payment. Other bank notes, the banks issued by banks, not the Bank of England, those are redeemed in payments to the banks of loans that you had taken out from the banks. Okay, so there's an equivalency. It's redemption that drives government money and also bank money. You can pay debts that you owe using those paper notes. can't run out of money. The possible consequences are overfull employment of resources and inflation. So the idea there's something unsustainable about running deficits just cannot apply when you're making payments using your own IOUs. And they will retain value as long as you redeem them for IOUs of the people who are holding them. You can get inflation, and you can spend so much that you're taking resources away from other uses. Why don't economists get this? One thing is it's more complicated today. I would bet that in 1832 what Smith was saying was obvious to economists. Adam Smith said virtually the same thing. It certainly was understood by the colonists in America. They understood exactly what they were doing. They were writing the laws, okay, that enacted redemption law at the same time that they're issuing the paper notes. They understood what they were doing. Today it's more complicated. Governments don't spend that way anymore, okay? So they don't simply issue notes and pass a law that says we're going to redeem them. So it's not obvious to economists anymore. And that is why we've had so many critiques of what we write, because economists today can't see through the complexity. Virtually none of them knew anything about the complexity before we started writing about it. No one really knew how the government spent. Okay? When I started writing Understanding Modern Money, I wrote to Mark Lavoie. How do they do this again? Who knows? Nobody knew. Economists don't know this sort of thing. People who work in the operations at the Fed and the Treasury, of course, understand. They have to. But economists didn't understand. So we have these operational constraints on modern central banks and on the treasuries that hide it. Another problem is that economists don't understand what banks do. They don't understand simple T accounts. I could provide examples of fellow post-Keynesians who get up and make fools of themselves trying to write a simple T account. One of our prominent critics got up trying to explain why we were wrong, did a bank T account and put bank deposits on the asset side of the bank. Okay, people are laughing. So at least some economists in this room understand that deposits are bank liabilities. They're not bank assets. Okay? Economists don't know that. It's clear Paul Krugman doesn't understand. Okay? And then finally, it's that they don't want the population to know the truth. I talked about Paul Samuelson. Here's another example, although I'm not criticizing Adair Turner. I think he's a very bright guy and he's on the right side of things. So he says, within limits, financing government spending by printing money absolutely, definitely does not cause inflation. Okay? Up to some limit. Now beyond that limit, yes, it would. I accept entirely that this is a very dangerous thing to let out of the bag. We need to keep this a secret. Exactly what Samuelson was saying. That this is a medicine in small quantities, but a poison in large quantities. But that there exist some circumstances in which it is appropriate to take that risk. Okay? So, the experts can know, but we can't let the politicians know. Okay? There's this tremendous fear that if politicians understood they can't run out of money, what would they do? Of course, spend without limit. Okay, that's the great fear. But is it true? Is there any evidence of runaway Weimar, Zimbabwe deficit spending? In all the rich, developed capitalist countries for the past 10 years, they've been trying to get inflation. They've been doing everything they can conceive of to get some inflation. They cannot do it. Okay? They haven't been able to do it. QE was designed to cause inflation. Negative interest rates in Euroland was designed to cause inflation. They can't get it going. Is there any evidence that politicians are not worried about inflation? No. They're consistently worried about inflation. I would say, overly worried about inflation. At least since the late 60s. They've always been focused on inflation. They're very worried about inflation. Is debt at historic highs? Well, except for Greece, no. Greece and Japan, no. In the United States, we're coming up to 100%. We've been there before. We were there at the end of World War II. And did it cause a tremendous problem? No. We had our best economic period ever with a 100% debt ratio. But anyway, the debt is not at historic high in the US or anywhere except a couple of years. Have we hawked ourselves to China? I'll deal with that. Okay. The answer is no. Does debt burden our grandkids? The answer is no. Will entitlements, this is the word that's used by people who want to get rid of Social Security and welfare and any other kind of social safety nets. They're arguing those are going to bankrupt our grandkids, so they have projections of, it used to be $60 trillion, but now people like Kotlikov are arguing it's at least $200 trillion in unfunded commitments to make Social Security payments. Okay, modern money, fiscal policy. I'm going to talk about fiscal policy, what the Treasury does, and monetary policy, what the central bank does. So this is just an overview. I already presented this, what fiscal policy is all about. Modern government spends on credit and bank accounts and the reserves of those banks. Now that's a simplification. I'll have to explain how they actually do it in the real world. The Fed and special banks help facilitate this process. So that is how, that's the complication. So that it appears that it's something different than what the first statement says. The sovereign government can afford to buy anything for sale in its currency. It taxes by debiting accounts. If government spending is greater than taxing, there have been net credits. We call that a deficit, and that means net financial assets have been created in the non-government sector. The government does not and cannot borrow its own currency, although it does issue bonds. Monetary policy summary. Central bank sets the overnight interest rate target. I talked a lot about that yesterday. It accommodates the demand for reserves, and it coordinates with the Treasury to supply and drain reserves. I only very briefly touched on that yesterday. I'll go into that in more detail. So let's start with what the central bank does. It's the government's bank. People forget this. Okay? 200 years ago, everyone knew this. It's why the central banks were created. The first central bank in the world was the Swedish, the second was the Bank of England. And from the very beginning, they were created to help finance the government. I don't know if I said it on the first day. The Bank of England was created because the King of England defaulted on his tally sticks. No one was going to accept tally sticks anymore, so he had to find another way to finance his spending. They weren't going to accept his debts because he wasn't creditworthy. Because he defaulted, he refused to accept the back in payment. Exactly why he did that, I have no idea. This is a pretty dumb thing to do, right? He couldn't run out of tally sticks, but he defaulted on that. So the Bank of England was created to issue banknotes. Bank of England wasn't doing anything unusual because that's what banks did. They issued banknotes when they lent. So the Bank of England issued the notes that the king was able to spend. They're empowered to set the overnight interbank interest rate. Okay, that's what they're known for best now. In the United States, the Fed was set up in the beginning really not to be the government's financial arm, although it did do that. It was set up to stabilize the payment system. The US was very unusual in that we didn't have a central bank, and we had the worst banking history in the world. Banks failed all the time, so banknotes wouldn't circulate at par. So that was the original purpose of the Fed. The Fed only gradually discovered that it had influence over interest rates. Okay, it didn't understand that in the beginning. The Fed did finance the government in World War I, and then financed it again in World War II. Okay, so it played the traditional role of the central bank in the crisis, but it really wasn't set up to do that. While most claim to be targeting inflation, there's little evidence they control inflation. Okay, now I'm not going to have the time to try to prove this to you. The central banks have been trying to get inflation going. They haven't been able to do it. Central banks took the credit for the low inflation that we've had, certainly since 2000, but generally speaking since about 1990. The developed world has uniformly had low inflation. Central banks took the credit. They said, yeah, it's because we've been focusing on inflation. But there are good studies that show that the central banks that pay the most attention, that is the ones that have inflation targets. It used to be true, I'm not sure it still is, but the governor of the Central Bank of New Zealand had to hit his targets or he was fired. Okay, so he had every incentive there is to hit the targets. Orestes and Sawyer have a good paper that shows that the inflation experience is no different at all, depending on whether you have an inflation target or, as in the US, you don't have an inflation target. The inflation experience is the same. Okay, my argument is the low inflation is a coincidence. I mean, it's a coincidence that we have central banks paying more attention to low inflation. It's not a coincidence that we have low inflation. It has to do with having 2 billion new low-wage workers who come into the workforce over the past 20 years. That is what gave us low inflation. The Fed has a dual mandate. We call it a dual mandate even though you see there are 3 things listed. It's always been sort of a strange thing. They are mandated by Congress to pursue high employment, price stability, and growth. That's the dual mandate. The Fed actually cannot pursue an inflation target. It can't do that because it has to consider the other 2 things. Right? So unlike the ECB, which doesn't have to look at employment, the Fed is required by law. The Federal Reserve Act requires them to pay attention to employment and growth. Usually central banks have some bank regulation responsibility. That's true in the US too, although often there also is some other authority. The US is very complicated. The Fed has responsibility. The Treasury's OCC, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, has authority. The FDIC, which is Federal Deposit Insurance, has authority. And then all of the banks that have charters with states have state regulators. So it's a very complex system. But the Fed has a role, and as I think it's Walker Todd, who used to work at the Fed, says, every time the Fed fails to do good regulating, its responsibilities increase. So it's a very strange thing. Every time it fails, it gets more responsibility. So it can fail even bigger the next time. When President Clinton came in, there was effort in his administration to take authority away from the Fed and put more in the Treasury. It didn't happen. It failed. And after the crisis, the Fed got a lot more responsibility. So our Fed has had its responsibility increasing ever since the Great Depression. Every time there's a problem, it goes more. Lender of last resort. Okay, this is what Bagehot in the 19th century was famous for discovering his book, his Lombard Street, that the central bank has to act against its own best interests whenever there's a financial crisis. Up to, I think, the 1840s, what the Bank of England would do in a bank run, so if a bank run starts on some banks in England, the Bank of England would call in all of its loans. Anyone it had lent to, it would say, you have to repay us right now. Why? Because we're worried you're going to fail. Now you can imagine how much worse that makes the problem. All these banks are in trouble. They might be subject to run. and the central bank calls in all the loans. They got to repay in Bank of England notes, so they don't have the notes to cover in case a run hits them. So they just says, no, you have to do exactly the opposite. Okay, you don't call in your loans, you lend without limit. That's the only way you can stop a bank run. So there's a doctrine that's been developed since his book, which I think in 1870 or something, that the conditions in which the central bank has to operate lender of last resort facilities. Generally, it's you lend without limit, which is what you said. You lend at a penalty interest rate because you don't want banks to borrow unless they really need to. So they should go to the private markets first. Can't borrow there, they come to you and they pay a higher interest rate. And only against good collateral. Good collateral means assets that in normal times you would be able to borrow against. Okay? Why do they do that? They don't want to lend to a bank that doesn't have any good assets because they should fail. All right? So they're only going to be lending to banks who are in trouble only because there's a crisis going on. I don't think I'm going to talk about the crisis in this class, but the Fed violated all three of those in the global financial crisis. Its crisis response was very poor. Eventually, it sort of learned as it went along. It was trying to put quantitative limits on its lending. That's why it always had these special facilities with a quantity limit that they would lend in the special facilities because they didn't understand you got to lend without limit. Okay, they lent against bad assets, and they lent at subsidized interest rates, not penalty rates. Subsidized rates for all the biggest banks. Okay, so it's clear what they were doing. They were lending to banks that should have failed. Okay, by long-standing tradition, and that would include all of our big banks. They didn't have good assets. They needed the very low interest rates in order to try to recover. They were insolvent. They weren't illiquid, they were insolvent. They should have been shut down. Footnote. The Fed is a creature of Congress. I'll give some quotes. Okay, this is long-standing understanding in the United States. The Fed is a creature of Congress. During the crisis when Bernanke was called in for Congress and Congress would be complaining about the Fed's response, he said, look, we're a creature of Congress. You don't like what we're doing, you change the law and tell us what to do. Okay. We'll do anything you tell us to do. We're a creature of Congress. Okay. So if you don't like it the way we're doing it, pass a law. He knew they wouldn't do it. Okay. So he's calling their bluff. But he recognizes they're a creature of Congress. The claims that the Fed is independent or controlled by banks. In the United States, we have both of these claims. I deal with them all the time. So generally, economists will all say the Fed is independent. The critics of the Fed, like Occupy Wall Street, or there's a whole group called End the Fed movement. They march around with placards and let's get rid of the Fed. Their argument is the Fed is completely controlled by the banks, okay, and operating in the interest of Wall Street, so we need to get rid of it. Both of those are overstated or wrong. The reason why people think the Fed is controlled by the banks is because technically the Fed is owned by banks. When the Fed was created, Congress didn't want to capitalize it. They said, banks, you capitalize it. So the banks essentially had to buy shares in the Fed. And over time, as new banks are created, they also become part owners of the Fed. However, these are very unusual shares. They cannot be sold. They earn a maximum return of 6%. So the Fed will pay them up to 6% out of the Fed's profits. And they get no voting rights. Okay? So these are unusual kinds of ownership. The ownership doesn't give you any voting rights. Now, Do big banks influence the Fed? Absolutely. Okay, at the very least, even if there's nothing going on behind closed doors, at the very least, the Fed, of course, worries about big banks. Little banks fail all the time. Fed doesn't bail them out, just lets them fail. Big banks almost never fail. Okay, we let one fail in once. And then the Fed said, we're not going to do that again. Okay. So they're very worried about the repercussions of a big bank failure. Now, big banks are taken over when they're in trouble, so that happens. Okay, but you don't just let them outright fail. The Fed is always subject to regulation by elected representatives, so it's a creature of Congress. In war or crisis, what has happened is that the Fed has been put under the Treasury. Both world wars, the Fed was put directly under the Treasury. In World War II, Congress knew that we would be running big deficits, and there would be a lot of government bonds issued. And they wanted to make sure the interest rates would be really low. So they put the Fed under the Treasury. They said, you buy bonds and you make sure that the short-term interest rate doesn't rise above 0.3%. And the long-term rate doesn't rise above 1%. Okay, so the Fed did that. The Fed campaigned to get free from the Treasury from the end of the war until 1951. And finally in 1951, they were free. It's called the Fed Treasury Accord, where the Fed was released from the obligation of buying bonds and keeping the interest rates so low. So anyway, my point is Congress can always change the law and put them under the Treasury if they don't like what they're doing. Its operations are largely accommodating so as to hit rate targets. That's what I was talking about yesterday. So if it's going to hit its interest rate targets, it's going to have to accommodate the demand for reserves, which means that its policy has to be linked to the Treasury's policies, for reasons I didn't go into, but will. Okay, the central banks, I was talking about the US, most of what I said will apply to the major central banks. For a while, the Bank of England also was sort of private, and then it's been brought back into the government in, I don't remember the year, but the central banks do not operate as if they were private banks. They are under some kind of control of the government. The central banks focus on the payment system. And the reason is because the number of payments is huge. Every day, billions of payments have to be cleared. And to make sure that there always are reserves in the system to make those net clearing payments, the Fed has to be focused on the payment system continually. Its main policy target is market rate in the US, the Fed funds rate, which again is typical, the bank rate. It also has a discount rate, the rate that it charges at the discount window. In the US, historically, that was set below the market rate, the Fed funds target, which meant that there was an incentive to go to the discount window to get low interest. And the Fed operated with non-interest costs, what we call frown costs yesterday, in order to prevent banks from taking advantage of that. So there's always the threat that if you go to the discount window, the Fed will look at your books, and that would discourage banks from trying to play the difference between the discount rate and the Fed funds rate. The Fed now is not trying to keep the discount rate below the market rate. So has a different system now. Historically, the Fed paid 0 interest on reserves. I talked about why that was yesterday. Now they pay a positive rate. So rather than needing to keep the discount rate below the Fed funds rate, what they do is they keep the interest rate on reserves below the Fed funds rate. And then the discount rate is higher than the interest rate that they pay on reserves, and they can keep the market rate in between those two things. I talked about yesterday, banks don't lend out reserves to their customers. They can only lend to one another. They use them for required reserve ratio, if one exists, and to make payments between each other. Central bank accommodates the demand, as I talked about yesterday. The Treasury, the fiscal agent of government. It's charged to make budgeted payments and receive taxes imposed by the elected representatives. As I said yesterday, these are two separate laws. There's a budget law and there's a tax law. And the Treasury has to abide by both of those. So tax law tells the Treasury under what conditions does it collect taxes, and it's supposed to pursue the tax collection according to the law. It's authorized to issue currency and other debts. From the very beginning, the Treasury has been authorized to issue currency. The US Constitution says only Congress can issue currency, and they have delegated that responsibility to the Treasury. This is another thing brought up by the Fed people. They say today the Treasury doesn't issue paper money, only the Fed does. They say it's a violation of the Constitution because only Congress can issue, and they had given it to the Treasury, not the Fed. However, the Federal Reserve Act details what the Fed can do, including issuing notes. Okay, so it's a misinterpretation because it is Congress that has the right to decide who can issue money. The Treasury still does issue the coins. Coins are only issued when the public demands them. Okay, so when Walmart says we're running out of quarters, they will use their bank and draw down their deposit account. The bank will use their reserves to purchase coins from the Treasury. So that's how they get into the economy. For the Treasury, the coins help it to finance its spending. So it won't be counted as part of the deficit if the Treasury uses coins in order to spend. But the problem is the Treasury isn't the one that makes the decision. They can't say, oh, well, let's finance a school lunch program by issuing coins. They can't do that, right? They only issue coins when the public demands the coins. So it's not like it gives it extra purchasing power. However, at the end of the year, when we total up its spending and its taxing, the part of the deficit will not be counted as debt, because we only count the bonds as debt. We don't count the coins as debt, even though coins are the Treasury's IOU. Everyone understand? So when a few years ago, probably it's about 5 years ago, we were running up against our debt limit, which I'm going to talk about. And Congress was acting like they were going to refuse to allow the Treasury to issue any more bonds. This follower of MMT was reading through this Coinage Act that had been passed not too long ago, within the past few decades, which authorized Treasury minting of platinum coins of any denomination. Any denomination. And so he said, why not coin $1 trillion platinum coin? Issue it, okay, sell it to the Fed, because the Fed buys the coins and then distributes them to the bank. Sell it to the Fed and get a credit to their bank account at the Fed, and they can spend that. Okay, it seems to be completely legal. It was brought to Obama, and Obama said, "We're not going to do that." Okay, now I never thought it had a chance because it's too gimmicky. So it's legal, but it's very gimmicky. It's obvious what you're doing, trying to get around the prohibition on the Fed buying debt of the Treasury, that is bonds. And because you can't issue the bonds, you're going to issue this platinum coin. But you could do it. Now, it doesn't have to be $1 trillion. The Treasury could start spending $100 coins, too. Legally, it's able to do that. But it's not likely to do it. It's a sort of quirk. Why did they do it? Because we have these private companies that issue, they're sort of like medallions. Maybe you've seen the advertisements of silver coins that you can buy. Maybe they've got $20 of silver and you pay $25 for the coin. And the idea is collectors keep them. It's really a scam, but the U.S. Congress wanted to support this activity. I suppose there were lobbyists who said, let us do platinum coins, and the Treasury was allowed to issue some of these. I don't think they ever did, but the law was passed. So anyway, it's a strange book that we've got. But it does shed some light on something. The reason why this MMT person, his name is slipping my mind, advocated this was not really to provide the finance, so that people could understand. There's actually nothing except law that prevents the Treasury from just spending its currency into existence, and it would make everyone realize you can't run out. Okay? Until we run out of platinum, you can't run out of platinum coins, and you can put them in any denomination you want. It's only self-imposed constraints that prevent you from doing it. Okay? These aren't truly economic problems, they're political problems. Okay, the Congress and President determine how much to spend, and they set the tax law. The Treasury is the only agent that spends the budgeted amount. The deficit is known only ex post. I said that either yesterday or the day before. So this idea that government's deficit spend is a misunderstanding. They spend and they tax, and after the fact, you can see if the two match or not. Okay, there's no such thing as deficit spending. There is spending and there's taxing. They're separate activities. Total spending, less taxes, at the end of the year totals up to either a balanced budget, a surplus, or a deficit. Generally, it will be true, because of the operating procedures we established, that at the end of the year, the new bond issues will be almost equal to that deficit number. Okay? So at the end of the year, it will be true. If the deficit is about $500 billion, there will have been about $500 billion new bonds issued. It's because of the operating procedures. It's not because the government borrowed the money that it spent. The spending is just authorized and it's done. Okay? Taxing is separately authorized and it's done. At the end of the year, we find out there's a deficit. We also can count up the bonds that the Treasury issued. It will turn out it's almost the same number. But it's not because the government borrowed money to spend. Right? The government's deficit will equal the non-government surplus. This is the sectoral balances approach. I'll say more about that on another day. And this is just an identity. This has to be true. If a dollar is spent, it had to be received somewhere. Okay, so either within the U.S. or outside the U.S. So if we total up everything except the federal government, the federal government's deficit will equal all other sectors of the world's accumulation of dollars. Has to. Sovereign government can't run that anymore. Okay, myths surrounding central bank independence. The main argument is that the Fed is or should be independent, and the reason is because it's believed you need the central bank to fight against the proclivity of politicians to run deficits and cause inflation. So you need the central bank to say no. Volcker or Martin, I can't remember, the head of the Fed, either Martin or Volcker, said it's the Fed's role to take away the punch bowl. Okay, so stop the party. So it's to counter what the other branch of government is doing. The perceived threat is that financing Treasury deficits leads to inflation and ultimately insolvency of the government. But the operational realities ensure that the Fed can't do that. It can't take away the punch bowl. The Fed does not have the ability to stop the Treasury from spending. And I'll go through the operational realities why that's true. There is some limited independence. The central banks select the overnight rate target, and usually in the developed capitalist countries, they do this free from intervention by the elected representatives. In the United States, until President Trump, the administration as well as Congress would keep their hands off interest rate policy. There's sort of an unwritten rule that Congress doesn't tell the Fed where to set the rates. They tell the Fed lots of things, but they don't tell them where the interest rate ought to be. So that's sort of a tradition. And the same thing with the administration. So they can set the overnight rate, and then they accommodate reserve demand to make sure they hit their target. In times of stress, they voluntarily cooperate, or Congress mandates cooperation. So I talk about what happened in the World Wars. Chairman Eccles from the 30s said, independence is pragmatic, not a universal law. So where it is pragmatic for the central bank to be independent, then it should be. Here are just a bunch of quotes from relatively recent U.S. history. Curry, who ended up in Latin America, he went to Colombia and lived the rest of his life. He was in the Roosevelt administration and moved to Latin America. The Federal Reserve is a creation of Congress and not of the Constitution. Its duty is to carry out the will of Congress. So, the U.S. Congress in '52 said the Board of Governors, like all other parts of government, must play as part of a team, not as an outside umpire. It exactly contradicts what economists say. They can't be the outside umpire. Okay? They have to be part of the team. This formal independence of the Board of Governors from the President is inevitably limited by the hard fact that fiscal and monetary policy has to be coordinated. Okay, this is what I'll be talking about. Clary, who was at the Fed, said, first, let's be clear on what independence does not mean. It does not mean decisions and actions made without accountability. By law and by established procedures, the system is clearly accountable to Congress. Not only for monetary policy, but for regulatory responsibilities. This is continuing with his quote. Nor does it mean the Fed is independent of the government. Although closely interfaced with commercial banking, the Fed is clearly a public institution functioning within a discipline of responsibility to the public interest. It has a degree of independence within the government which is quite different from being independent of the government. Thus, the Fed is more appropriately thought of as being insulated from political pressure. That's all. And the Fed is not unique in that. Many of the agencies of government are supposed to be independent from political pressure. Right now, we have a big controversy about the Veterans Administration. Okay, same thing. They are supposed to be independent from political pressure. Okay, so the Fed is not unusual. This idea that the Fed is independent is just false. Okay, legally it is not. How the government spends, okay, so this is the simple version. In that paper with Tamoin, we're responding to the critics. They really hate the simple version. Okay, so we gave them the complicated one. The problem is they can't follow it. They can't understand the complications. Right? And so what they present is just wrong. It's not the way the government actually works. Our argument is this simplification doesn't leave out anything important because the results will be the same. You can use this model, the simple one, and you can use the complex one that captures all of the realities, and at the end of the day, you end up with exactly the same balance sheet. Okay. At the end of this PowerPoint, I have a bunch of T accounts that show you the balance sheets for the simple version where the government just spends directly, and then for the complicated one where they have to use their account at the Fed and the Fed cannot buy bonds from them. Compare the final balance sheet for every case. It's always the same. So all of the operational realities don't change the final balance sheet. The final impact on the government sector and the non-government sector is exactly the same. So they don't make any difference. And the operational realities were designed to make sure there is no difference. Okay? In other words, it was to get around the self-imposed constraints. They developed the operations procedures so they can get around the self-imposed constraints so that they're not constraints. So it's not surprising the end of the story is exactly the same because that's what they were designed to do. So spending leads to credits. The government credits bank reserves and the bank credits the account of the recipient. Taxes, and this is true no matter how complicated you make the model. At the end of the story, that is the result. Taxes lead to debits. The government debits bank reserves and the bank debits the accounts of the taxpayer. Deficits mean there are net credits. The government net credits bank reserves and the bank net credits the account of the recipient. So here's a simple model. So this is sort of a circuit, but this is a circuit only of the government's money. And this is what is usually left out of the circuit approach. So the government spends its currency, subjects or citizens receive it and they use it to pay taxes. Okay, there are two things that are obvious. The government can't run out of what it spends, and the subjects cannot pay taxes until the government spends. So there is no way that the government could start by spending its tax revenue, because there is no tax revenue until it spends. So the spending logically has to come first. This solves the infinite regress problem. Where does it come from? It came from the government. Okay. Now, obviously, that is too simple, because today the Treasury always spends through the central bank, and the payments are made through private banks. So I talked about 2 degrees of separation, so you can see the 2 degrees, the banks and the central bank. So when the Treasury wants to spend, the central bank credits the reserves of Bank 1. Bank 1 credits the deposit account of the contractor. Let's say the government is buying contractor services. All right. When taxes are paid, we just reverse the operation. The taxpayer's deposit account is debited by Bank 1. The central bank debits Bank 1's reserves. So if the spending is greater than the taxing, the result is there are net credits to Bank 1's reserves, And there are net credits to the household sector's deposit accounts. Okay, so that's exactly what I had said before. Now, so from the point of view of the non-government sector, when they look at what happens, what they see is the banks see their reserves go up when there's government spending, their reserves go down when there's tax payments. What the household sector sees is that their deposit accounts go up when the government spends and goes down when there's taxes. That's all they see. Okay. They don't see what goes on inside the government. It makes no difference to them. How do the Treasury and the Central Bank coordinate their operations so that all of this happens? They don't see it. They don't care. It doesn't matter. Okay, so what I'm saying is, whatever operational procedures are adopted between the Treasury and the Central Bank, they're completely irrelevant to the non-government sector. Okay. They can change them, and they do. They change their operations from time to time. It doesn't matter to the non-government sector. It makes no difference to them at all. Exactly how they coordinate. All right. Now I'll start talking about how it is that they coordinate in the U.S. And Felipe Rezende, who was my student, studied Brazil. Turns out it's virtually identical. Brazil does it the same way that we do. And other people have looked at Canada, the UK, exactly the same. So it's very common. I can't say that it's true for every country, but it's true for the ones we're looking at. Australia too, same. So anyway, the Treasury and the Central Bank have to adopt procedures so that the Treasury can get the Central Bank to make that reserve credit so that the bank will make the payment to the recipient of the government spending, and then vice versa. So we need to see how the Treasury and Central Bank coordinate those activities. Okay, it's all sort of how it is. The Orthodox believe that the government chooses either bond finance or money finance when tax revenues aren't large enough to finance its spending. So when there's a deficit, the government has a choice to make. The government is supposed to face a budget constraint just like a household does, or a firm does. Bill Mitchell looked into the history of thought. When did this idea of a budget constraint come about? It's in the late 60s. And it's when there was this attempt to apply consumer theory to the government sector. So it really was explicit. The household has a budget constraint. Let's see how we can apply that to the government. Okay, so very explicitly, they wanted to come up with nearly identical for the government. Now, of course, there is one difference. Households don't print money. Government does. So that is the difference between the household budget constraint and the government budget constraint. So the government spending, G, plus, so G is its purchases of goods and services, plus its spending on the outstanding debt, so debt it already incurred, is the interest rate times bonds, minus taxes, and if what we usually do is we put taxes minus transfers, so this is a net tax concept. That's how you treat transfers. I just sort of ignored them here, but of course governments also make transfer payments in addition to just purchases. So that's taken care of as a taxes minus transfers on the left-hand side. Well, the difference between the government spending on goods and services plus its spending on interest minus taxes, that's its deficit. How does it finance its deficit? By issuing bonds and issuing money. So this is supposed to be a constraint. The government can choose how much borrowing it wants to do and how much money printing it wants to do. Of course, borrowing is preferred over money printing because Milton Friedman taught everybody that printing money causes inflation. So the preference of orthodoxy is to use borrowing rather than money printing so you can avoid inflation. The way that modern money theory sees this equation is as an ex post identity. The argument is that at the end of the year, we can total up taxes, T, bonds that are issued, plus new high-powered money, and that will equal government spending. It's an ex post identity. It's not a policy choice. You did not decide how much money printing there would be versus how much borrowing there would be. In fact, money printing and bond sales occur whether you have a deficit or not. They occur almost every time the government spends. So they're not a policy choice. You didn't decide that you would borrow instead of printing money. The proportion of bonds, new bonds outstanding and new high-powered money outstanding is not determined by the government at all. It's determined by the non-government sectors. Okay. It's the decisions that are made in the banks that determines how many bonds will remain in the system. I'll explain why that's true. A budget deficit increases non-government sector net financial assets held in the form of bonds or cash plus reserves, which is what high-powered money is. The deficit itself is mostly not determined by the government. It's determined by the non-government sector. It's determined by their desire for net financial assets. Okay. So the deficit itself is not a decision variable. It's an ex post outcome from the operation of the economy. So just to quickly explain that, it will depend on economic growth, which largely depends on the non-government sector itself. If the non-government sector is worried about the future and they're not spending, then growth will be low, could even be negative, which means tax revenue will be low. If tax revenue is low at the end of the year, you end up with a budget deficit. And that budget deficit will increase the net financial assets in the non-government sector to satisfy their desire for net financial wealth. So when they're worried about the future, the way that it's usually put, instead of spending, they want to save. It's the deficit that allows them to save in the form of net financial assets. So that is what determines the size of the deficit. So the deficit is not a decision variable, and the division between bonds and money is not a decision variable. Okay? So it's not like the household decision at all. When they try to apply the consumer's budget constraint to the government, it's inappropriate. And that should be obvious because the consumer budget constraint is an individual decision. Okay? It's micro level economics. This is macroeconomics. The outcome will depend on the operation of the macro economy as a whole. Okay? So it's not a decision that can be made by the government. It's an outcome of the operation of the economy. Role of taxes. I mentioned Beardsley Ruml before. I wanted to go into his arguments in just a little bit more detail. So the title of his paper, Tax for Revenue are obsolete. National states no longer need taxes to get the wherewithal to meet their expenses. Okay? Why then does the national government need taxes? I get this all the time. In fact, I had 2 emails this morning from people who read our stuff. They said, well, if you don't need taxes, then why have them? Everyone hates taxes. Just get rid of them. Well, of course, the answer is, the most fundamental answer is, if there were no tax, you wouldn't accept the currency. So from inception, there is no demand for currency without taxes, which is right. Okay? But here are more answers. So here are Ruml's answers. Why does the government need taxes? As an instrument of fiscal policy to help stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar. So you need taxes to take some of the demand out of the economy. If government spending puts it in, you need to take some back out. So use taxes to prevent inflation. To express public policy in the distribution of wealth and of income, as in the case of the progressive income tax and estate tax. Okay, so you use taxes to prevent people from getting too rich. So we call that redistribution, but you're not redistributing anything. What you're doing is you're taking income away and burning it. That's what taxes on the rich do. You're destroying the wealth. You're not redistributing the wealth. To express public policy in subsidizing or in penalizing various industries, so these are sin taxes. You tax pollution, you tax alcohol, and so on. To isolate and assess directly the cost of certain national benefits such as highways and Social Security. So the idea on highways is that government can choose. Do you want railroads? Do you want airplanes? Or do you want roads? Right? And so what we want to do is charge you to make sure that if we're building the roads, that's what you really want. You have to be willing to pay for it. So we charge you road tax. Usually it's through your gasoline tax. But we charge taxes so that only if people are willing to pay them do we build you the roads. Okay, we have an airport tax. Only if you're willing to pay that airport tax will we build you an airport. So that's the idea. Conclusion. These are his words. Briefly, the idea behind our tax policy should be this, that our taxes should be high enough to protect the stability of our currency and no higher. Now it follows from this that our tax rates can and should be lowered to the point where the federal budget will be balanced at what we would consider a level of high employment. So we're using taxes to prevent inflation, and ideally the budget should be approximately balanced when you're near full employment. It should start running a surplus when you get beyond full employment. Milton Friedman had exactly the same proposal in 1948. Okay. In fact, he said that all government spending should be financed by printing money. This was a different Milton Friedman than 1960 Milton Friedman. All government spending would be financed by printing money, and you run a balanced budget at full employment. What that means is that the taxes equal the government spending, so you'll be taking all that money back out. Now, the one thing they both missed, but it's not surprising they missed it in 1947 or 48, you're ignoring the external account. Okay? If you have an open economy, you can't aim for a balanced budget at full employment. I'll talk about why that's true. So if you're a country like the United States that has a current account deficit, you must have a budget deficit, even at full employment. So they didn't understand that, but of course the US was not going to be running a current account deficit in 1948. We were going to be running surpluses. Currency sovereignty and policy independence with a floating exchange rate, and I'm going to come back to why I say that. Floating exchange rate. And a domestic currency, government's ability to make payments is not a revenue constraint. Logically, the sovereign currency must be issued before it can be collected. Okay, that's what the diagram shows. Households and firms are currency issuers. They have to obtain it first through income or borrowing. The government is a currency issuer. It can spend the currency into existence. I discussed yesterday Warren Mosler's realization that bond sales are not a borrowing operation. They're part of monetary policy. They help to keep the interest rates from going to zero. Because when the government spends, it is putting reserves into the banking system. If the banks already had all the reserves they wanted, this causes excess reserves. So the government has, either the Treasury or the central bank has to sell bonds to get the reserves out of the system, otherwise the interest rate will be pushed towards zero. Okay? And so this is why when the government spends, there will be bonds sold to get the reserves out if it creates excess reserves. And this is regardless of whether you end up in the year with a deficit, a surplus, or a balanced budget. The reason is because, let's say the government spends every day, which is not unrealistic. Every day reserves are being credited to the banks. You have to sell some bonds to get those reserves out, or every day you would be causing the interest rate to move towards zero. So continually you have to be selling bonds. Modern self-imposed procedures do not really impose constraints. Central bank and private bank operations ensure the Treasury can spend up to the budgeted amounts. What's the evidence for that? Treasury checks don't bounce. Okay. So the Treasury makes its payments on the first of every month. There are, I don't know how many seniors in the US, 70 million, who receive their Social Security checks. And none of that bounce. That's evidence that the Treasury and Fed know what they're doing. Because it's just inconceivable that the tax revenue would match exactly the checks that are being cashed in that first week of every month. Taxes don't flow in that way. So they must know what they're doing. Central bank focus on payment system and interest rate target ensure smooth operations. Treasury checks never bounce. Bill Mitchell is the Australian MMT person at a conference where someone from the Central Bank of Australia was objecting to some of the stuff he was saying. He said, well, hold a second. Would you, central banker, ever bounce a Treasury check? And the guy thought about it for about 15 seconds and said, of course not. There you go. If you're not going to bounce a check, then the self-imposed constraints do not matter. That's what you're telling us. They don't matter. Won't modern money theory cause hyperinflation? Everything that I talked about so far today is description. It's not a policy recommendation. People always make this mistake in believing that when MMT says that the government spends by creating bank accounts, bank reserves go up, all that, that's a recommended policy. That is, we're recommending that the government start doing it that way. That's not what we're doing. We're describing the way that it actually works. Tomorrow I will give you a policy. So far I haven't given you any policies. I'm just describing the way that it works now. Okay. We do have two main policies that we recommend. One is a job guarantee, so that's a policy. And the other is zero interest rate policy. That's a policy. But everything else is just a description. Okay? So if printing money that is just crediting bank accounts leads to hyperinflation, we would have hyperinflation all the time. Because that is the way we do it. But hyperinflation is very rare. I'll talk about that. MMT policy, such as the job guarantee, and I would also say zero interest rate policy, is actually less inflationary than orthodox Keynesian policy. It will achieve full employment with less inflation than a Keynesian policy would. So our policies are actually less inflationary than orthodoxy. I'm not going to talk about job guarantee. Let's look at hyperinflation. Kagan wrote the most famous paper on hyperinflation. What was it, 1959, I think, it's a long time ago. He defined it, of course this is somewhat arbitrary, it's high, very high inflation. He defined it as 50% per month. He found that in hyperinflation, money growth is very high, but not as high as inflation. Well, that's a problem if you're a monetarist, and Kagan was a monetarist. Because money causes inflation, how could inflation be greater than the growth of the money supply? It didn't make much sense. So he came up with a clever explanation for why that is. It's because velocity rises. Why does velocity rise? Because you all know that the value of the money you're getting will go down very quickly. So you spend it as soon as you get it. So it's sort of hot potato theory of money. As soon as you get it, you spend it. So the velocity goes up, all right? And that is what causes inflation to exceed the rate of growth in money supply. But the argument is still money causes the inflation, okay? And when you're increasing the money supply at a very high rate, you get inflation up to a high enough rate that people won't hold money anymore. They spend it as soon as they get it. No, they're still accepting it. They still accept the money. There's a question about that. They will still accept it, but they'll spend it as soon as they get it. The usual explanation is that the reason why so much money is being created is because the government is running deficits and it's money financing the deficits. So it's really not the central bank's fault, it's the Treasury's fault. It's because the government is spending so much, tax revenue can't keep up. I mentioned this also before, because taxes are calculated with a lag. If inflation is 50% a month, tax revenue won't increase fast enough. So the deficit increases, so you have to print even more money, which increases the deficit, you have to print even more. It's ironic that quantitative easing really does increase government money tremendously, and the hyperinflationists, the people who always worry about hyperinflation, said it will cause hyperinflation. And of course it did not. It didn't have any measurable impact on inflation. MMT explanation of hyperinflation. So I was asked about this. Just repeat what Bill Mitchell found. Government always spends by keystrokes if money printing causes hyperinflation, and it should be very common, but it's not. It's very rare. If high deficits cause high inflation, then Japan would have the highest inflation in the world, because they've got the highest deficits and debt ratio that any developed country has ever been able to achieve. And they have deflation for 20 years. 20 years of deflation with the highest deficits in the developed world. Hyperinflation is actually very rare, limited to countries that have fixed exchange rates, gold standards, and or, often it's both, debts in foreign currencies. So those are the countries that can have hyperinflations. They are countries that are exposed to exchange rate crises. The hyperinflations occur in the context of exchange rate crises. And hyperinflation is related to severe political and social crises. So here are the two examples. Bill and I have a macro textbook that's coming out, and there's long discussions of these. So I'm really briefly summarizing what you wrote in there. As I answered, Germany lost World War I, had unbearable reparations payments, it had to be paid in gold, they had to export, but they had lost a large part of their industrial areas. I think they were in Belgium, so that they couldn't use those to produce the output that they could export to service their debt. Productive capacity wasn't sufficient even for their domestic demand, and the government couldn't just raise taxes to prevent the domestic consumers from consuming because they were starving. So there wasn't an option of trying to take more resources away from the domestic sector. So the government instead competed with private demand by just trying to buy output they could export in order to earn the gold. Germany's producers had to borrow in foreign currency to import, and so that's what creates the currency crisis. Currency depreciating raises the cost of imports and the reparations payments in terms of their own currency. Hyperinflation resulted and ended with new tax-driven currency. Zimbabwe, whites were 1% of the population, owned 70% of the productive land. After land reform, food production fell by 45%, unemployment rose to 80%, exports declined by 57%. Part of the reason for that was they also had a currency crisis, and they couldn't get the intermediate goods they needed in manufacturing. So the manufacturing sector just collapsed, and that's why exports collapsed. Collapse of supply was the main cause of hyperinflation. So while it's true that using tighter fiscal policy might have helped fight inflation in both those cases, their problem wasn't fundamentally related to the budget deficits. So it's true that tighter budgets might have helped reduce inflation a bit, but the inflation wasn't caused by too much deficit spending. How are we doing on time? I quickly looked through the remaining slides, and there's a lot of them. But a lot of them are on the self-imposed constraints. I'm going to be really quick on them because really the only purpose in doing it is to explain why the simplification really doesn't matter. So we go through how they really do it in the real world, and this is all about the United States, but as I said, with one exception, these are very typical self-imposed constraints. In the United States, and everywhere, you have a budgeting process. Well, that's a self-imposed constraint, okay? Because you're deciding how much to spend and what you're going to spend it on. And so, of course, there's lots of discussion and political maneuvering to decide what should be in the budget and how much you spend on those things. That then authorizes the Treasury to spend, okay? So that kind of constraint makes perfect sense. You don't want to tell the Treasury, spend anything you want, right? And you're not going to do that. In democracies, the elected representatives decide how much you're going to spend. All right. In the US, we have a second limit that's called the debt limit. This one is unusual. It was enacted in 1913 along with the Fed. And it says that it puts a limit on the total quantity of bonds the Treasury can issue. Okay, so they set a limit in 1913 on the quantity of bonds the Treasury could issue. Now, of course, soon after that, we went into World War I. And so they immediately got up to the limit. And so Congress raised the limit. And so that has happened frequently. Every couple of years, we reach the limit and Congress has to raise it because our debt has been going up since 1789. It goes up. And that normally is not a problem at all. It's not, there isn't a big political fight about it. They just raise the limit. But beginning about a decade ago, the Republicans decided every time we come up to the limit, they're going to make it a political fight for political reasons. So they say, and if you think about it, it's very strange because they already agreed to the budget. The budget tells the Treasury how much to spend. But then when we get close to the budget limit, they go back to the items they don't like in the budget, which are all the things the Democrats wanted. And they say, if you don't take that out of the budget, we won't raise the debt limit. So we've come close to the Treasury running out of funds and not being able to issue any more government bonds, in which case then it has to prioritize what it will spend on and what it won't. And it has to limit its spending to the deposits it has at the Fed. It can't issue any more bonds to increase the deposits. As taxes are paid, the deposits are increased, so it could increase its spending only when taxes come in. Okay? It's never happened yet. There's still always the possibility. Trump is now saying, if you don't give me my wall, we're not gonna, he won't sign the Congress's debt limit increase. So we don't know, but the point is, obviously, this is self-imposed, not imposed by markets. In fact, the markets generally would like to see this go away because you get all this uncertainty when you get close. So it's a crazy thing. It's unique to the US. Then you have operational constraints. And these four are typical. The Treasury writes checks on its account at the central bank. Well, in the old days, they really were physically writing checks and putting them in the mail. Now it's deductions from their deposit account at the Fed. Most payments are electronic now. And that has been a requirement since 1913 too. The Treasury moved to making payments out of its account at the Fed. The Treasury also issued paper notes for a long time, but they don't do that anymore. So that's not an option anymore. All Treasury spending now takes this form. The other operational constraint also was put on them in 1913, which is that the central bank cannot buy Treasury bond issues from the Treasury. The central bank, of course, can buy bonds in the open market. They do it every day, all the time, but they can't buy them directly from the Treasury. And it's clear what Congress was thinking, that this will limit the Treasury to market discipline. They'll have to sell the bonds to the markets, and if the markets say no, then they can't go into debt. Okay? Congress was very worried about having a strong central government with tremendous fiscal power. We did not have that in the US until after World War II. Our federal government was very small. On the eve of the Great Depression, federal government was 3% of the economy. That's a tiny, tiny government. State governments were stronger, federal government was very weak. Everything has been flipped around, of course. The federal government now is 25% of the economy. But anyway, that's why they did it. The Treasury uses special depositories. They're not that special because there's like 1,000 of them. Banks all over the country have deposit accounts for the Treasury. And the reason for that is that when the Treasury receives tax payments, the Treasury initially deposits those in the private banks. They cannot write checks on those. Why would they put them there? The reason is because if tax payments were all deposited at the Fed, where the Treasury writes its checks, that movement of deposits to the Fed leads to a debit of bank reserves, okay, as I already have said. Every tax payment would debit bank reserves. So every time somebody writes a check to the Treasury, a private bank would lose their reserves. So this would lead to great instability of reserves because you never know when people will pay their taxes. And the Fed would always have to be putting those reserves back in the system. So they wanted to regularize it. So initially, all the tax payments lead to a deposit at the Treasury's account at all these private banks that are all over the country, so that the private banking system doesn't lose reserves. And then the Treasury will periodically warn the banks and the Fed and say, hey, on next Wednesday, we're going to move $1 billion out of our private deposit accounts and put them in the Fed. So then the banks and the Fed can get ready to compensate by putting the reserves back in. So that's why they do it that way. And then finally, these same special depositories have loan accounts for them. Okay, a loan account is used by the Treasury to get around this second prohibition. The Treasury can sell bonds to these special banks and get a deposit in their account that they can then move to the Fed. Normally when the Treasury sells bonds, banks lose their reserves. Okay? But these special depositories can use this special demand deposit account. When the Treasury sells them a bond, they don't use reserves to pay for it. They just credit the Treasury's demand deposit. So you see they get the bond as an asset, the Treasury's demand deposit is the liability. They just credit their demand deposit. It then sits there until the Treasury needs to move it. And the Treasury gives the advance warning, hey, we're going to be moving our deposit accounts. Okay? Now if the banks need reserves, or they don't want to hold the bonds, they can sell them to the Fed. The Fed can always buy the bonds directly from these banks. So it's an end run around the prohibition here. The Treasury can always sell the bonds to these banks, they stand ready to buy them. Now in addition, we have dealer banks. Whenever the Treasury wants to auction bonds to the general market, not selling it to these special depositories, the Treasury will ask for bids, and the dealer banks, I think there's about a dozen of them, are required to put in bids. So there's no question about the Treasury being able to sell bonds, is what I'm saying. Okay? Until we hit that debt limit when they can't issue them. But there is always going to be special depositories who will buy them and credit their demand deposit. And there will be dealer banks who will buy them and then sell them and try to place them in the market. The only question is the interest rate. And this is true for all the modern governments. You have dealer banks that stand ready to buy. The only question is the interest rate. Now sometimes you will hear a Treasury auction failed. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that there were no buyers. It means the Treasury didn't like the interest rate. Okay, so they put in bids, the Treasury says, we don't like those, we're not going to sell them, we'll wait. Okay, so they can always do that. So the people who are bidding get to choose what interest rate they want to pay. Right? And if they don't bid a low enough rate, the Treasury can choose not to make the sale. It can then sell them to the depositories if it really needs deposits to the Fed. So these procedures ensure that the Treasury is always able to get deposits at the Fed in spite of the prohibitions on the Fed from buying bonds, because you've got special depositories and dealer banks that will buy them. And then if they don't want them, or let's say the dealer banks bid on them and bought them and can't place them in the market, the Fed stands there ready to buy. Why is the Fed ready to buy? Because it's pegging the interest rate. It's pegging the market interest rate. And the short-term bonds are perfect substitutes for the overnight interest rate, the Fed funds market in the United States. So in order to hit its target, the Fed will take the bonds that are putting downward pressure on the interest rate. I'm sorry, putting upward pressure on the interest rates in order to hit its over 5-year target. So the prohibitions don't make any difference because they've developed procedures to make sure that they always get deposit accounts. These procedures that I'm describing, and they're in much more detail here and in the paper, have evolved over time. Periodically they change them. If they can figure out a way to make the system work more smoothly, they change the operating procedures. These are not in the law. The Fed and Treasury work out how they're going to do things to mitigate the problems that exist because of what is in the law, okay, the self-imposed limits. So, I don't know how much, in the appendix I go through balance sheets that show this, that we can take account of the prohibition on the central bank buying the bonds. We can take account of the requirement that the Treasury has to sell bonds to banks before it spends because it needs to get deposits at the Fed. So it will have to sell the bonds before it spends. Banks have to get reserves to buy those bonds in the auctions, but the central bank provides the reserves that banks need, because if it didn't do that, it would miss its interest rate targets. So as long as your central bank is focused on the interest rate targets, it has no choice but to supply reserves that banks need to buy the bonds that are being offered for sale, to get the reserve, to get the deposits in the Treasury's account at the central bank. Okay. I show the balance sheets, and at the final step, you will see the balance sheets are the same with and without the self-imposed constraints. So adding these in doesn't change the final balance sheets at all. Then I go through something that's a bit more real world, okay, a little more complicated than that, which has 3 steps in it, a simple case, but it still doesn't include everything. And so then I go through, I think it's a 6 step, which includes the actual operating procedures that are used in the US. These 6 steps are involved every time the Treasury spends. It doesn't matter whether at the end of the year the budget will be balanced or in surplus or in deficit. The Treasury will always go through these 6 steps. The order of the steps can change, but they will always go through the steps. And when you read through these, you will see that in these steps, bond sales are always involved. Reserve credits are always involved. So, in other words, there always is borrowing and there always is money printing every time the Treasury spends, even if you have a balanced budget. So, we don't face the government budget constraint option or choice to use borrowing or money printing. You're always borrowing and money printing, even when you don't have a budget deficit. So what we're saying is, there is no choice. Given the self-imposed constraints and the operational procedures, the Treasury always issues bonds and prints money, no matter what the budget outcome is. So there is no budget constraint and no choice over financing method. They always follow the same steps, correct? I don't want to go through it here. The paper goes into it in very much more detail than this. Policy implications. Government can't go bankrupt in its own currency. It can go bankrupt in somebody else's currency. Okay, if you issue liabilities in another currency, you can be pushed into insolvency. It happened to Argentina. Okay, so that can happen, but not in your own currency. Government can always afford to buy anything for sale. If there's unemployed labor, government can always buy it. So that's the topic for next time. The only economic constraints government faces are full employment and inflation. The other constraints are political. That's not to say the political constraints aren't important. Of course they are. And they should be. These are supposed to be democracies. So the elected representatives should have control over government spending. What I didn't say, okay, I did say sovereign government faces no financial constraints, can't become insolvent, but it can only buy what's for sale. Okay, if things aren't for sale, government can't buy them. If they're not for sale in your currency, you may not be able to buy them. Now, if you can exchange your currency for the currency the sellers want, then you can still buy them. And that would apply to virtually every country in the world. Okay, so even if real estate in your country is only for sale for dollars, if you can exchange your currency for dollars, you can still buy it. I didn't say government ought to buy everything for sale. Okay, you want to leave resources for the private sector. The size of the government is a political decision with economic effects. If you look at capitalist countries, let's say successful ones, the government ranges from 20% to 50% of the economy. US is at the low end. US and Japan are down around 20, 25%. France is at the high end of the range, 50%. It seems the capitalist economies work fine in that range. When you start looking at countries that have smaller ones, I don't know what your government size is. Mexico is about 13% of the economy. For me, it would be hard to say Mexico is a well-functioning economy. Okay, so I think when you get below 20%, maybe the government's too small. Possibly above 50%, the government might be too big. I don't know, but 20 to 50% seems to work. It's a political decision. Americans don't like government, and I guess the French do. So, you know, it makes sense that we have a small one and they have a big one. I didn't say deficits can't be inflationary. They definitely will be inflationary if you increase spending when you're already at full employment. You're definitely going to get inflation because you're going to bid against resources that are already being used. They can be inflationary long before full employment, depending on what you buy. So if the government is out there bidding for your most skilled workers, bidding for the output of highly unionized sectors, you're almost certainly going to get inflation long before full employment because you're going to still have low-skilled workers who are unemployed. And I didn't say deficits can't affect exchange rates. So a budget deficit might affect your exchange rate. Now, there really isn't evidence for this. It's a very common belief that deficits cause your currency to go down, but there isn't any empirical evidence for it. Okay, I'm waiting for somebody to show it. Greenspan said that there is. Greenspan said, heck, we have no idea what determines exchange rates. Nothing works empirically. Okay? Everything that people propose fails. It doesn't work. If deficits cause depreciating currencies, Japan's yen ought to be extremely weak. It doesn't happen. If current account deficits cause your currency to go down, the dollar ought to be really weak. It doesn't happen. Okay, so there isn't anything empirically that works, but I know that there's the belief, so I will admit it could happen, in spite of the fact that it doesn't. Sovereign currency summary. Is there anything? I don't think there's anything here. Okay. I want to get into exchange rates. Most nations adopt a domestic currency. The currency is an IOU of the government in the money account. Alternatives, you can peg, convertible, that gives you the least policy space. Because ultimately, you've got to hit your peg. So you have to operate your economy in a way that you'll be able to hit the peg. Okay? That might require a lot of unemployment, and typically it does. It might require low inflation in order to hit your peg. So you will operate your economy that way. You're constrained in what you can do. Managed currency gives you more policy space. Now, how do you define managed? Probably every currency in the world is either pegged or managed. There really aren't completely freely floating, so there's a bit of a continuum here. Relatively speaking, you would say the Chinese currency is managed and the US dollar is floating. Okay, but does the US manipulate its currency? It doesn't admit it. Does the Fed look at the exchange rate when it sets the interest rate? Yes, it does, but it says it's not our responsibility to try to stabilize the value of the dollar. The US Treasury is the one that actually does have the authority to do it, but they don't intervene, at least not in recent years. So we're towards the floating end. A managed currency gives you more policy space than a pegged currency. Generally less policy space than floating, because if you're not trying to manipulate your exchange rate, you can completely ignore it and focus on your economy. However, you can manage your exchange rate and still have almost complete policy space if you have enough foreign currency reserves. So if you look at Taiwan, Singapore, China, until recently, because they lost about $1 trillion of foreign currency reserves. They had enough foreign currency that they probably could operate their economy without trying to look at the exchange rate. I mentioned Goodhart's article on the two views of money. The dominant view is metalist, or M theory, which also works well because it's monetarist theory, where money originates and evolves due to private sector attempts to reduce the cost of exchange. So you begin with barter and go through the whole story. So long as paper notes, the government's money is backed by 100% gold, it retains value. If too much money is issued, it falls apart. So this is applying the M view to the domestic currency. When we move to the foreign value of your currency, we're talking about exchange rates. In the orthodox approach, prices serve as signals. So when you're doing your microeconomics, the prices are what make the invisible hand work, right? You react, you take the price as the parameter and you react to the price system. The same is true with the exchange rates. The exchange rate is just the foreign price of your currency, and it is supposed to be sending signals. The role of money is to lubricate the market mechanism. It only determines nominal things, not real things. The government comes into the story as trying to get some purchasing power through seigniorage. So we talked about the original use of the term was with respect to coining gold, but since most countries now, well, all countries have gone off gold, now there is tremendous seigniorage and printing money. Orthodoxy doesn't come down unanimously on one side or the other on whether you should have a fixed exchange rate or a floating exchange rate. So those who adopt a fixed exchange rate follow Hume in arguing that a fixed exchange rate system will work well to lead to trade balance because of the specie flow mechanism. So if your country has inflation, gold will leave your country and your currency will depreciate, and that will help to rectify a current account imbalance that's caused by your domestic products cost too much and foreign products are cheaper, caused by inflation. So the specie flow mechanism was supposed to balance trade. So this idea came from Hume, and it still lives today. The flexible exchange rates argument is the one that Friedman took. He said Friedman preferred the fixed exchange rate system. He said the problem is government's cheap. So they promise to convert to gold, but they issue too much money. So they get caught and they have to default. So ideally he preferred a gold standard, but they don't work in practice. So he said we should have a flexible exchange rate system. That will work too, because if you just let your currency devalue when you have a current account deficit, that will automatically rectify. So cleverly, he argued that you get the same result with a flexible exchange rate. And he was making this argument in the 60s when we were moving toward flexible exchange rates, growing up with that system. So Mundell sort of combined the two. He said that within areas that are closely integrated, where you have free capital movement and free labor movement, it makes sense to use the same currency. So effectively, that's a fixed exchange rate system within an optimal currency area. But between optimal currency areas, you should have flexible exchange rates. Okay, so that will allow the adjustment, the trade adjustment between optimal currency areas. So are you guys familiar with Mundell? Won a Nobel Prize for this. His example was, it makes no sense to have a Canadian dollar and a US dollar, because the east parts of Canada and the US are fairly well integrated and very similar, and the west parts are similar and well integrated, so you should have a Western dollar and an Eastern dollar, not a Canadian and US dollar. Using the same currency would allow even better integration within those areas, and the advantage of taking the currency away from the national governments is it removes the temptation to just print up money to finance your spending, because now the US government would not have the US dollar. Okay, we would have two optimal currency areas, and the government would be prohibited from doing that. So you sort of combine three different things. He won the Nobel for that, and in Euroland the argument was, slides. Maybe not. The argument was that, well, the Euro area is really not as well integrated as you would expect for an optimal currency area. Okay. However, we can make it an optimal currency area. Okay. Mundell had denied that the Euro area was an optimal currency area, so he didn't agree that it was an example. But the argument was it can become one. Now, after the euro was adopted, Mandela wisely did take credit for it, at least until the crisis. One time he had a small conference and he bought a villa in Siena. He has this huge dining room. Probably could seat 200 or 300 people. He has the banner that he was given that says the father of the euro. So I think eventually he became proud of it, even though in the beginning he was sort of against the idea. So anyway, that's the idea behind it. Now the alternative, I'm returning to Goodhart's paper, is C theory. We say chartalism, the British say cartalism, or sovereignty, currency sovereignty. The use of the currency is based on the power of the issuing authority. Money is tied up with sovereign power. So it's not something that came out of markets. It came out of the attempt of the sovereign to move resources. And they didn't do it through seigniorage, they did it through sovereignty. What do I mean? It's not because they would take a couple of ounces of your gold that you brought into the coin. It was because they imposed taxes. So it was the tax that drove the currency. So C theory begins with the government and the need for the government to provide the infrastructure and institutions that are necessary for a market economy. Breaking the link between state and currency reduces fiscal power to achieve the public purpose. Here's Win Godley writing in 92. Win Godley was always against the euro and played a role, as did Goodhart, in keeping the UK out. So although they were members of the EU, they were one of the European countries that was never expected to join the euro because they refused to make that a condition of being a member of the EU. He said the power to issue its own money, to make drafts on its own central bank, is the main thing which defines national independence. If a country gives up or loses this power, it acquires the status of a local authority or colony. So those countries that join the euro, they're giving up their national independence. They are taking on the status of a colony. Exchange rate systems. We had about one generation of a gold standard. It was at the end of the 19th century. It's really the only time where the major countries adopted and practiced a gold standard. It collapsed in the Great Depression. All the countries gradually were forced off gold. They, for one thing, needed to devalue their currencies because of a trade war. And they had banking problems. They didn't want to have to lose all their gold in an attempt to convert all dollars on a run. So anyway, we then got the Bretton Woods system from World War II to 73, which was a fixed but adjustable system in which everyone pegged the dollar and the dollar was pegged to gold. So foreigners could exchange dollars for gold. Interesting, Americans could not. So that's not quite a classic gold standard because your domestic residents are not able to convert dollars to gold. In fact, Americans could not legally hold gold. You could have rings, but you couldn't hold gold bullion in America until, I think, President Ford. Nixon is the one who took us off Bretton Woods. I think it was President Ford who signed the law that overturned the prohibition on owning gold. When the U.S. went off gold, that was the end of the Bretton Woods system. And since 73, we have had a dollar standard, but the dollar floats. So the dollar is the dominant international reserve currency, but the dollar is a floating currency, not a fixed currency. You note that the classical gold standard, as well as the Bretton Woods system, each lasted only one generation. That's as long as they last. There's some talk about a new Bretton Woods system. The Chinese have sort of floated that idea, and now they're moving toward possibly internationalizing the RMB, thinking that maybe it can replace it. My wife is going to give a talk that will touch on some of that, so I'm not really going to do it. Davidson has taken up this issue several times, first in a paper and then in a book. He's returned to Keynes's original plan, which is a banker proposal. It was the alternative to the Bretton Woods system. Keynes came in a weak position, of course, because the U.S. was so dominant after the war. The U.S. plan, which was Harry Dexter White's plan, is what was adopted in Bretton Woods. But Davidson has tried to revive the banker plan, which has some particular features that are better than Bretton Woods. So anyway, in his paper, he looks at the movement to a flexible exchange rate. Friedman had argued it's going to balance trade. Well, in reality, it didn't. Okay, so there's something wrong with it. The capital flows swamp the trading goods and services, so there's no tendency for trade imbalance to lead to the currency adjustment that would bring you back to balance. Bretton Woods has by far the best record. It's better than the gold standard and better than the flexible exchange rate. Faster real growth in the developed countries and the less developed countries. So this was a golden age, not just for the U.S., but also for developing countries. Post-73, we've had 100 current, I don't remember when the paper was written, now it would be a lot more than 100. 100 currency crises, rising international indebtedness, and tendency to stagnation. So why was Bretton Woods better than the gold standard? It can't just be the fixed exchange rate, because the gold standard is a fixed exchange rate system. The problem is that if you have convertible currencies, then the market will punish the debtor nations. So what Keynes had in his Bancor plan was a redistributive mechanism. If you didn't use your Bancor reserves, you would lose them. And so there was an incentive to either spend them, lend them, or give them away, because you're going to lose them anyway. And that would redistribute to the debtor nations. So that was the whole idea. You need to put the burden of adjustment on the surplus nations. They're the ones who need to spend more. You don't want the debtor nations to spend less, okay, because that depresses global aggregate demand. So why did Bretton Woods work better? It had, I don't have the slide for it, it did have a bit of a redistribution in the beginning, and that was the Marshall Plan. So I think the number is about 3% of US GDP was redistributed through the Marshall Plan. That gave purchasing power to the mostly defeated nations. And that prevented them from having to adjust in the downward direction. They were able to spend more. That benefited the US too. The problem was that eventually the US was running trade deficits, and because we had promised to convert to gold, there was a fear that all those dollars out there would be converted to gold. And I think it was the French that triggered it. Nixon went on. Okay. The sovereign currency alternative. A sovereign country with its own floating currency doesn't need tax revenue. It imposes taxes to drive the currency, not for revenue purposes, and credits bank accounts. So, should you avoid a trade deficit? in a country that has its own currency. The typical belief is that if you have a current account deficit, you're growing too fast. And what you need to do is slow down your economy so that you import less and you'll be able to export more. The question is whether that makes any sense for a country that has the ability to spend as much as necessary to keep their economy affordable. In real terms, imports are a benefit and exports are a cost. Because imports are the output of other countries that are using their resources to produce stuff that you can consume. Exports are a cost because you have to devote your resources to produce stuff that you don't get to use. So a trade deficit leads to net benefits. This is what orthodoxy teaches, and in real terms, this makes sense. The problem is that countries that run current account deficits face two sorts of problems. One is that when they are importing, they might be displacing, current account deficit. When they're importing, they might be displacing domestic labor. So they end up with unemployment. And the other problem is that the conventional way to deal with a current account deficit is to slow your economy down, which produces more unemployment. Okay, so the response makes it even worse. But if you have your own currency, as I said before several times, the sovereign government can always afford to put all unemployed resources to work. The government can always hire the unemployed. Now, generally, they don't do that. I'm saying that they have the potential to do it. In any event, a trade deficit results mostly from external decisions. So we're talking about the United States. Our current account deficit results from the rest of the world wanting to accumulate dollars. They export to us so that they can get dollar assets. They may even purposely reduce imports from us because they don't want to use their dollars for imports. They want to use their dollars to accumulate as net financial assets. So the trade deficit results from the rest of the world's desire to net save dollar assets. This puts a different interpretation on how trade deficits are financed. So the traditional view, as I said before, is that the United States borrows dollars to pay for the imports. And if the Chinese stopped lending to America, America wouldn't be able to buy the imports. But viewed from the modern money theory point of view, China is accumulating dollars because they want dollar financial assets. The way they get those dollars is by exporting to us. When a Chinese exporter receives payment in dollars, they deposit at their bank. In the old days, the Chinese firms and households were not allowed to hold dollars. So it's automatically going to be converted to RMB. The Chinese bank sends the check onto the Chinese Central Bank, which credits their reserves in RMB. Now, the check is just a claim on some US bank. So it's a demand deposit at a U.S. bank. And the Central Bank of China sends that on to the Fed, and the Fed credits the Central Bank of China's reserves. That's how China gets the dollars. Okay, they're in the form of reserves at the Fed. So not only do domestic banks have reserves at the Fed, foreign central banks have reserves at the Fed. The China's reserve deposits earn zero interest, even now. So we now pay interest on reserves of the private banks, American banks, but we don't pay interest on reserves of central banks. So those are non-earning reserves. China, of course, is rational. They would rather earn interest. So they buy US Treasuries. So the Fed debits their reserve account and credits their bond account. The Fed actually, Treasury bonds are nothing more than a bookkeeping entry. We don't ship a bond over to China and they keep it in the drawer. It's just an accounting entry. And those accounts are kept at the Fed. So effectively, all the Fed is doing is debiting their checking account and crediting their savings account. And then they get interest. So that shows up as a US Treasury, but it's just an account at the Fed. So that's how all those dollars got there. People think that the US government has borrowed dollars from China to finance its deficit because China's ending up with the bonds. But you see, it's all because of Chinese exports to the US that China ends up with a reserve deposit that they then convert to a US Treasury. Now they don't have to buy US Treasuries. They also started buying mortgage-backed securities. Okay, and they learned to regret that because they had the same problems that everybody else had. Problems with mortgage-backed securities. So anyway, I don't have the graphs, but if you look at which foreign countries hold US Treasuries, and you can plot it and you can see it changes over time. 20 years ago, the biggest holder by far was Japan. Okay, Japan also was by far the biggest exporter to the US, a net exporter to the US. And so a net exporter to the US is going to end up with treasuries for exactly the reasons I just went through. Now, do they have to buy treasuries? No, they don't have to. But they choose to. Okay? Because if the purpose of net exporting to the US is to get dollars, you want to hold those dollars in the safest way you can, which is US Treasuries. So especially if you're trying to maintain the value of your currency, that's the purpose of your international reserves, is to protect your currency. Then you want to hold it in a safe form, you don't want to hold it in a risky form. So you will tend to end up with US Treasury bonds. And so anyway, as China became the biggest net exporter, its accumulation surpassed Japanese. Is it because the US government is borrowing from Japan and China? No. They end up with those bonds only because we have a current account deficit. If they didn't have current account surpluses against us, they would not be accumulating US Treasuries. So it's not the budget deficit that leads to them holding US bonds. It's the current account deficit that leads to them holding US Treasury bonds. Okay? It's not because the US Treasury needs to borrow from the Chinese. It's because the Chinese want to export to the US. That's why they end up with US Treasuries. Okay? So the trade deficit results from the rest of the world desire to net save dollar assets, and the trade deficit finances their saving. Now, what I'm arguing here will sound very familiar because it's exactly what Keynes said about the saving-investment relationship. Saving doesn't finance investment. It's better to think of it the other way around. Investment finances saving. Why? Investment creates the income that can be saved. Okay? So the causation goes from investment to saving. What I'm arguing here, it's exactly the same. It's the current account deficit, which is US spending, that finances the rest of the world's saving in dollars. The causation is exactly the same. It goes from spending to income to saving. So they end up with saving in the form of US dollar assets. Orthodox view of the twin deficits is that if the government runs a deficit, that pushes interest rates up. So that's the crowding out hypothesis. A higher interest rate causes your currency to appreciate because the rest of the world wants to earn your higher interest rate, so they buy your assets. And currency appreciation leads to a trade deficit. So this is the conventional view of the relations among those things. The alternative view is that there is a symmetry, but it's not that one. The two are related, current account deficits and budget deficits, but it's a different one. A budget deficit occurs when the non-government sector wants to net save in the form of sovereign debt. That is what gives you a budget deficit. So in the United States, when our private sector wants to save, we end up with a budget deficit because they're not spending, income growth is low, tax revenue growth is low. We get a budget deficit. A current account deficit occurs when the rest of the world wants to net save dollar-denominated assets. Okay? So they both occur because of a saving desire. You get a budget deficit when your domestic sector wants to save. You get a current account deficit when the rest of the world wants to save, in the form of dollar assets, or your currency's assets. The common view that this net saving of the non-government and rest of the world sectors finance the government and trade deficits is confused in identity with causation. The causation goes in the reverse. So it's not that the domestic savers are financing the budget deficit. It's the budget deficit finances their saving. It's not that foreigners are financing the current account deficit. It's the current account deficit finances their saving. Okay, so this is the injections lead to leakages causation that everyone's familiar with when you talk about saving and investment. No one understands this. It's the same thing. So this is what all the post-Keynesians react against. I say, it's just the saving investment relationship. It's exactly the same one. All of you agree with me when I say investment finances saving. These are equivalent. They're the same thing. It has to be this way, logically. Burden of the debt. The Orthodox say that budget and trade deficits burden future generations because you got to pay it off. So the U.S. is now the world's biggest debtor. Actually, that happened 20 years ago. We became the world's biggest debtor country. Okay? Now, interestingly, the income flows are still in our favor. We're the biggest debtor, but we earn so much on our assets abroad, it more than offsets our payments to our creditors. When that turns around, then our debt will grow even faster. Okay? Right now we earn more than we have to pay, even though we're the biggest debtor. Okay, so let me go through it. Is it true that these burden future generations? We have to distinguish between the government buying something and the private sector buying imports. Okay? When a U.S. non-sovereign consumer, okay, so someone who's not the government, lives in the U.S. and they're going to consume, buys an imported Toyota from Japan, they have to either give up your income, sell an asset, or go into debt. Clearly that's a burden. Okay? So importing from Japan is a burden on American consumers. They had to give something up. The Japanese exporter holds a dollar claim on a US bank that will be converted to a yen claim. Everything I said about China, it's the same for Japan. They end up with a dollar reserve. The American used her income or sold an asset or went into debt. There's no free lunch. There's no free lunch for American consumers who buy imports. I suppose everyone has read Barry Eichengreen, who claims exorbitant privilege. Americans are getting all these free lunches. There is no free lunch. Okay? The Japanese exporters do not give these things away. No American consumer got a free Toyota. Okay? There is no free lunch. So there's a burden, and it's a burden right then. Okay? They had to pay for it somehow. However, increased American purchases of a domestic output have exactly the same result. There's a burden. There is no difference. For an American consumer, it doesn't matter if the Toyota is made in Tennessee or Japan. Okay? The result on them is exactly the same. By contrast, if the US government imports a Toyota, it truly gets something for nothing. It issues dollars. Right? It's just a keystroke. However, the US government has a policy of not buying from foreigners. They buy American whenever they can. Okay, so US government purchases of imports is very small. Now, of course, there's import content, but they don't go to Japan to buy stuff. For the most part, they buy it home. But if they did, they would get something for nothing. But when they buy it home, they also get a free lunch because they buy it in exactly the same way. It's just a keystroke. So anything the government buys is a free lunch. So the part of the imports that are government purchased are free lunches. Is the US unique? Barry claims it is. Only the US gets this privilege of free lunches. No, it's not true at all. Every government with its own currency gets a free lunch for everything that it buys. Everything the government buys is a free lunch. And nothing that is bought by consumers is a free lunch. Okay, because they have to use income, sell an asset. The ability is related to the power to impose taxes in the domestic currency, while seigniorage income, so this is the orthodox view, is sometimes equated to the total quantity of net imports. Imports purchased by the non-sovereign population don't provide any free lunch. Now here, I'm talking about the financing part. There is no financial free lunch when you buy stuff from foreigners if you're not a sovereign government. Implications for a small country, this is from a talk for the Czech Republic. Importantly, the Czech Republic did not join the euro. Okay, so that's important. They still have their own sovereign currency. And I wanted to keep a small, open country, so I didn't just change the name to Brazil, because I wanted a small country. Brazil's not a small country. With a floating currency, the Czech Republic can exogenously set its interest rate. So their central bank sets their interest rate because they have their own currency. National government doesn't need taxes or bond sales to finance their budget deficits. National government bond sales function to drain excess reserves from the banking system. All of this is going to sound familiar because it's exactly the same as the US. It's a part of monetary policy. The Czech Republic can financially afford to buy any good or service that it's capable of producing. Plus, it's able to buy whatever the rest of the world is willing to sell to them for their own currency. And their currency is accepted in exchanges. When you go to airports, you can check the board and see, can I convert Czech currency, the crown? Yes, you can. They can afford full employment. Indeed, unemployment is a cost. Employment is a benefit. Okay, unemployment is a cost because you're wasting a resource. Employment is a benefit, you're putting them to use to produce things. A national government budget simply finances the non-government sector's desire to net hoard high-powered crowns, and a current account deficit finances the rest of the world's desire to net hoard crowns. Okay, so there's no difference between the US and the Czech Republic, which is a tiny open economy. Now you could say, well, on this last one, there is a difference in terms of the quantity. Okay, and it's true. The world's demand for US dollars is insatiable, completely insatiable. We can't provide enough. Okay. The world's demand for Czech crowns is small. Okay. They could exhaust it, probably. We can't exhaust the demand for dollars. Is that the US's fault? Is there anything the US can do about this? I don't see what the US could possibly do, except provide more dollars, which we do, right? We run our current account deficit, well, until Trump. Maybe he's going to try to do something about it, which will just make matters worse. The rest of the world is not going to get the dollars that they've been used to receiving, and they're not going to be happy about it. So anyway, there's nothing the U.S. can do about this. Why did it happen? Well, it's a long story. It goes back to the Mexican crisis, the Asian tiger crisis. What countries learned from the Asian tiger crisis is you can't have too many dollars. You can definitely have too little. You can't have too many. And so they all changed the operations of their economies to the goal of exporting to the U.S. What can the U.S. do about that? What should we do about it? Okay, well, Trump has his ideas. I think it's the wrong one. The right one would be try to satisfy the demand and also try to convince countries to stop fixing their currencies, stop pegging their currencies, stop managing their currencies. Then they won't need the dollars. Now, China will relatively soon float. They're going to. Okay? And they're going to need fewer dollars. They probably have more than they would need once they decide to float. But we have other countries that are absolutely committed to pegging their exchange rates, and they're going to need dollars, and it's insatiable. So as many as they can get, they will take. So is it U.S. hegemony? Now, there may be U.S. hegemony, but it's not about this. So in terms of military power, yes. And I don't know if you saw that now the Trump administration has plans to put together a space army so that they can dominate space too. The rest of the world preference for dollars is due in part to the size of the U.S. economy. So there is something about the difference between the size of the Czech Republic and the size of the U.S. government. But I would point out, Australia is a very small economy too. And the Australian dollar is in huge demand. Okay, why is that? Because pension funds decided it was a good idea to diversify into Australian dollars. And suddenly there's a huge demand for Australian dollars. Okay, why is that? Well, Australia is a commodity exporter, and one way to sort of buy commodities markets is to buy the Australian dollar. So it's a way to diversify into commodities indirectly. You don't have to own commodities, you own Australian dollars, and you are in commodities. That's the thinking. So I don't know if there was something about the Czech Republic that made its currency desirable to global pension funds. Suddenly there would be a huge demand for crown. But anyway, size of the economy does matter, but it's not the only thing. U.S. trade deficits require the rest of the world desires to sell more to the U.S. So everyone says China might decide to not to export to us, or they might decide they don't want more dollars. Well, eventually that will happen, but it's going to be a slow transition. They're not going to wake up tomorrow and say, we're going to sell all of our dollars. For one reason, because it would impose huge losses on them. Okay, they're well aware that if they sell dollars, the value of their portfolio is going down, they're going to suffer the losses. And central banks don't like to make losses, even though there's no reason why they can't. They don't like to, so they're not going to do that. And besides, they can't export to us without getting dollars. They're going to end up with dollars if they export to us. So they can't decide not to export to us if they don't want dollars. If Japan and Euroland decided to pump up their economies to eliminate their trade surpluses, they too would be forced to reach seigniorage income, and they would be part of Barry Eichengreen's exorbitant privileged group. It's their decision. They could spend more and start running current account deficits, but they're choosing to be net exporters. What about the exchange rates? The counter-argument is only the U.S. can run persistent trade deficits without causing exchange rate depreciation. Okay, and that could be true. Beyond some point, the U.S. would win in the race to run huge trade deficits. Okay? It's not going to affect the value of the dollar because the demand for dollars on the capital account is so huge. Okay? And we probably are unique in that. It's because the US dollar is the #1 international reserve currency. But that takes two to tango. It's because the rest of the world wants the dollars that we end up in the position of running current account deficits with a strong dollar. Under the current rules of the game, economic success is measured by the quantity of dollar reserves accumulated. That's how you win under the current rules of the game. So this will sound familiar to people who studied economic history. It's mercantilism. Okay? You won by accumulating gold. Today you win by accumulating dollars. It makes perfect sense under mercantilism, the original mercantilism, because they were pegging their currencies. It doesn't make sense if you're not pegging your currency. Okay? Winning by accumulating dollars only makes sense in a pegged exchange rate system. Otherwise it makes no sense. It makes no sense for a country to export their output in order to get dollar claims, unless they want to peg their currency. So if they floated their currency, the rules of the game would be completely different. That would be seen as a losing strategy. You export everything you produce, that's a loser, not a winner. The winners are the ones who get to consume and have good living standards, not the ones who are trying to export everything and keep their population poor. But if you're trying to peg your currency, it makes sense to export and accumulate dollars and keep your population underbid. The analysis for countries on flexible exchange rates requires a new paradigm, which is modern money theory. Further, the evidence demonstrates the high costs of fixed exchange rates in terms of high unemployment, low economic growth, fiscal and monetary policy constraints. Now, I admit, not every country that manages their exchange rate has this problem. Okay, China has been very successful in managing their exchange rate and raising their living standard faster than any country has ever done. But they will reach a limit. When the living standard rises enough that their workers are no longer able to outcompete the West, they're going to have to change their strategy. Versus the advantages of floating rate regimes. By the way, when Paul Davidson found the 100 currency crises, I would like him to tell me how many of those were floating rate countries. Okay, it is fixed exchange rate countries that have currency crises, not floating exchange rate. I'll be glad to be proven wrong, but all the examples I know of are countries that are trying to manage a currency, and George Soros says, hey, I can break them. That's what happens. You get a currency crisis, including the UK. One of the biggest economies on earth, George Soros broke them in a day. And the newspaper said he made $1 billion. He said he made a lot more than $1 billion in one day. And he said he did no speculation whatsoever. All he had to do was count. That's all he had to do. If you could count, you could win. He knew that he could accumulate more claims than they could cover. Okay, that's all he needed to do. So he's been trying to teach people you should float your currency. It's sort of his task in life. But a lot of countries still have it. So let me conclude. The government is a monopoly supplier of its currency, determines conditions of supply. Then they can choose what kind of exchange rate system. With a floating exchange rate system, affordability is never an issue. You can always afford anything for sale in your currency. The consequences of too much spending include inflation, too few resources left in the private sector, and possibly exchange rate depreciation. I'll say it's possible. A managed exchange rate system, you have additional constraints. You have to maintain foreign currency to manage your exchange rate. You could have a run on your currency that could lead to a currency crisis. Now, you still can't be forced to default because you're managing your currency, you're not pegging it. You're not promising to convert. You can still get a currency run. So China has had a currency run. They lost $1 trillion and then they had to sort of take 2 steps back and put capital controls back. But they can't be forced to default because they're not promising to convert. Eventually, they can just let the currency move. Finally, a pegged exchange rate system has an additional constraint, which is default. Okay? Now, in all cases, there are always political constraints, operational constraints, myth, and misunderstanding. So countries may not know that if they have a floating exchange rate, that they don't face an affordability problem, and I can use Obama as an example. He kept saying we ran out of money. But we have a floating exchange rate and our own currency, so it's impossible. But he believed it, I think. At least he said it. And enough people believed it that we end up with unemployment. So you don't necessarily take advantage of the options that are available just because they're available. You may believe that there's something that's training you. I can't remember what I had one more also. At the end, there are all of the balance sheets. Much simpler than the article I gave you to read. So if you want a simple proof that there's no difference once you've added the operation constraints, just go through the balance sheets. Any questions? Yep.
You said that one policy recommendation of the MMT is the job guarantee. I would like to ask if universal basic income would have the same effect.
No. That was a simple answer. When he asks again, I guess it's Monday, I'll talk about the job guarantee. Then, after I present what the job guarantee does, then I can give you more specifics. But no, it doesn't. It doesn't help stabilize wages, doesn't help to, obviously doesn't solve the unemployment problem because that's not what it's trying to do. And it will be inflationary. So no, it doesn't. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm trying to fit all the assumptions that we saw in your lecture to our reality here in Brazil. And when we look at the surface, there seems to have several similarities, but as we go through deeper, we see that the Brazilian reality is a little bit twisted rather than a little bit different. So, for example, once reserves are available to commercial banks here in Brazil, they, in the very next moment, are allocated to public bonds, mainly. Mm-hmm. So this creates another layer of opportunity costs, because we have one interest rate, which is the interest rates that are paid by the government, by the Treasury to the public bonds, and another private interest rate, which is set on the interbank market. So this starts to make some distortions that I am wondering if it's a particular case of the general assumptions in Brazil, or if it can be a completely distortion of what we see on the general theory that requires to have a sovereign money, and once these distortions start to come up, we see that the local currency, the real, starts to lose part of the sovereignty because the private sector is financing public debt over the years and the issuance of the debt. So is it a distortion of the let's say, the general theory that you're presenting, or we can say that is a local practice that is influenced by politics, and then everything else?
Actually, I don't think there's any difference. What you described is exactly what happens in the U.S. The Fed cannot leave excess reserves in the banking system. Now, we have to go back before quantitative easing. Okay? Before quantitative easing, the Fed never left excess reserves in the banking system. The total quantity of reserves is only $50 billion on average. And so when the government spent and reserves are credited, they would be drained immediately, just as in Brazil. I think the big difference between Brazil and the US would be the interest rate. Okay, Brazilian interest rates are very high, typically, very much higher than the United States. So our interest rate, say, on average, higher than it's been recently, would be, say, 6% on long-term bonds, and then lower rates on shorter term, and then finally, let's say 2% on 30-day bonds. 2% would be the Fed funds target. Okay, so you've got this premium, you're paying 6% on long term, and say 2% on short term. There's a premium there of 4%. That's sort of the extra cost that the government is paying of issuing long-term bonds. Now, your extra cost could be a lot greater than that. And your base rate is also a lot higher. Your target rate is a lot higher. So that would be the difference. The market can't tell you that you must issue 30-year bonds. Okay. That is a decision of the government. You could just say, we're only going to issue 30-day bonds. So I talked about this the other day. If you only issue 30-day bonds, you're going to pay the central bank's target interest rate. So that is one way to reduce the amount of interest that you're paying on government debt, which would, I think that's what you mean by this inefficiency that's being put in. A very large part of the budget goes to pay interest on outstanding debt. And then people say, well, we're spending so much on the interest, we can't afford to spend more on something else, which isn't true, but it can be a political constraint on what the government spends. And it also can be an inflationary constraint, because all that interest income goes somewhere. So if the debt ratio is 100% and you're paying 10% interest, you're talking about a huge injection of interest income into your economy. And that can be very inflationary if all that interest income gets spent. If you reduce the interest rate by reducing the maturity of the bonds, you will be cutting interest spending, which makes your budget look smaller. And also you have less inflationary impact because spending will be smaller if the private sector is getting less interest.
But what we see is that the government in the bonds, they offer hedge for inflation.
Well, they
Okay.
should. Obviously, that's inflationary.
Yeah, exactly, because it affects the total debt. But they also offer through central bank hedge against exchange rate through the swaps, and also against increases on the interest rates because it's post-fixed. There are some in prefixed is a very little amount of total debt. So isn't it a way to put this liability over the commercial bank to decide whether they are going to make available the reserve for the general public instead of putting that available?
No. Banks can't make their reserves available to the general public.
Not the reserves, but the cash balance that they have to lend. So they have to choose it.
Well, they don't lend the cash. They don't lend cash. When they make a loan, they create a demand deposit. So what you're saying is the banks aren't doing that.
Yeah. They are lending to the government. So in
Well,
fact,
not really, but they're ending up. So they're holding bonds as their earning asset. They don't want to make loans as their earning asset.
But doesn't
That's
it
the way I would
breaking the so-called independence of the central bank by over that, because in the end the reserves are going to finance public debt.
Well, they're not financing the public debt. It's the operations of the central bank require that they get the reserves out. Okay? Otherwise, they can't hit their interest rate target. If they have excess reserves in the system, the pressure will be down on the interest rate. So they sell the bonds to keep the interest rate from going down.
Yeah.
So it's not that suddenly they've decided they're going to borrow instead of issuing reserves. It is that they want to provide a higher interest alternative to banks to get the reserves out of the system to reduce the downward pressure on interest rates. So what you're describing is an indication that the government is confused. And I mean, I'm not criticizing your government alone. There's nothing new about that. Our government is confused too. Does our government believe that they're borrowing from the Chinese? Yeah, they probably do. Do they believe that they're borrowing from private banks? Yeah, they probably do. What I'm saying is they're not. Okay? So your government is taking a step farther. Not only do they believe that they have to borrow, they believe that they have to offer tremendously good terms in order to borrow. So they say, okay, we're going to protect you from any inflation risk, any currency risk. We're going to offer you all these incentives. They don't have to offer any of them. All they have to do is offer them something better than zero. And the private market will take it. If your option is 0 or 1, you'll take 1, right? If you're rational. And you can run the system so that they will get 0, which is don't pay interest on reserves. And then whenever the government spends, they're going to end up with reserves, they get 0. Okay? And then you say, hey, would you rather have 1? We can give you 1. They're going to take it. You don't have to say, would you please take 40 plus we'll give you inflation cover. You don't have to do that. But I understand what they're doing and why they are doing it. I'm just saying you don't have to do it that way. So they don't understand the game that they're playing. They really do think they're borrowing, and they're very worried that the markets won't lend to them unless they give them really generous terms. But it's just not true, because they're not borrowing. And if the market said, we won't buy your bonds, the correct answer would be, good. Okay, we would rather pay you less anyway. But I know they think that they would run out of money, but it's not true. They can't run out of money.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay?
Anything else?